So our first order of business will be to get this registration code to work properly, not just compile, but work properly. And you'll notice the API is a little bit like Ninjix Fluent API for configuration of the container. I'm saying that when anyone wants an iLogger, please use an instance of SQL Server Logger. And that's using generic arguments to specify the different types, which is quite useful. However, I will tell you that in many situations, there will be instances where people cannot use generic type parameters like this. The great thing about generic type parameters is that they can make methods strongly typed. The downside is that you have to know the type at compile time. And there's also, as we'll see a little bit later, some types that don't work as a generic type argument. I'll show you an example of that in a bit. And essentially what I'm saying is that I would like two versions of for. I would like one version of for that takes a generic type parameter, we'll call it tsource, and I would like another version of for that doesn't take the type as a parameter, as a generic parameter, but takes it as a system.type reference. So I'll have another method that takes a parameter called source type. And what this version of for can do is return whatever the other for method returns using type of tsource and just forwarding that call along. And you'll see this quite often in many APIs that take generic parameters. There'll be a version of the method that takes a generic parameter and a version of the method that takes a type as a regular method parameter instead. And that allows you to work with the strongly typed methods when you know types at compile time, and just work with type references when you are doing some reflection code or doing something at runtime. But having those methods in place, there's another trick that I've learned over the years when building out these types of Fluent APIs, and that is to come up with a special class that knows how to do configuration and build this object out. Specifically, instead of returning this as a reference from the for method, and then all the chain methods have to be in here like use, instead of doing that, I want to create another class. I'll call it a container builder. And yes, container builder is a nested class inside of container. That's going to be useful for reasons that we'll see in just a bit. And some of this is just experience in building these types of things before, but this container builder will take a constructor that will give it a reference to its parent container and also associate it with a specific source type. And what I'll need to do in the container builder is save those references off. So I'll have an underscore container private field and an underscore source type private field. Underscore container gets the container parameter, underscore source type gets the source type parameter. And now we can start to do some interesting things. So instead of for returning container, I want it to return a container builder, both of these methods. And when I return a container builder, I'll return a new instance passing in myself, this reference, and the source type that's being used. And that's all I need with the for method for right now. The problem the C# compiler will have is that now that for returns a container builder doesn't have a use method. But that's okay, I can come back into container and take this use method and bring it into container builder instead. And I will call this generic parameter tDestination to distinguish it from the source type. And just like we did with for, I have a feeling that I'm going to need one version that takes a generic parameter and one version that takes a system.type reference. And this first version, the one that takes a generic type parameter, will use the other version of use, passing along tDestination as a type reference. And we could continue returning container builder so that in the future, if we have additional configuration APIs, we can continue to chain those methods together. But for right now, when someone says, for iLogger, use SQL Server Logger, what do we do? Well, ultimately, a container is a map. It's a map that maps from one type to another type. So I will actually have a dictionary in here that maps from one type to another type. So I will want an entry in here that essentially says for a key of iLogger, use SQL Server Logger. And it's going to be the container builder that can actually write something into this map. Because it is a nested class, it has access to the container's private field. So I can say container, inside the map, let's add a new entry that goes from source type to destination type. And then we can return ourselves. And at this point, I should be able to run the tests again, and the build succeeds, but the test is still failing because we have not implemented the resolve method as yet. So the resolve method will take a T-source. Essentially, this is where I say, I want to resolve something that implements the iLogger interface. And once again, I'm going to go to the trouble of providing a resolve that takes a generic type parameter, and also a resolve that doesn't need a parameter. You pass a type reference. So type is source type. We'll see exactly why this is extremely useful later, I promise. But this first resolve method can return the other resolve just by passing along type of tSource. And the nice thing about this resolve method is that I can say, if you're looking for a component of type tSource, I can guarantee you that I'll return something that is a tSource. So I can cast whatever resolve finds. And now this resolve will never know what type it's actually going to return. But what it can do is look inside of the map to see if it contains an entry for the source type that someone is looking for. And if it does, I can say that the destination type is the entry in the map for the source type, and just return activator.createInstance on that destination type. So when someone asks me for an iLogger, this should return SQL Server Logger, and I'll create an instance on SQL Server Logger. If it doesn't contain a key, what do I do? Well, this is the point where I would probably write a custom exception class for this container. And since we're a little bit constrained on time, I'm trying to take just a few shortcuts. I'm just going to throw a new invalid operation exception that essentially says what you're trying to do is invalid for the state of this object because you haven't registered that source type. And we'll say could not resolve plus source type dot full name. That will be the exception that we throw. And now let me run the test, Control RA. That will also do a build. And I can see that the test passed. So we have the first feature for our container working, which is I can walk up to it, and for some abstract type, I can register the concrete type that I want. When I ask it to resolve that abstract type, it gives me back the proper concrete type. Now we can move on to the next step, which is going to add a little bit more complexity.